To a particularly apropos uh, chapter, the respiratory system. As you know, the COVID-19 is attacking respiratory systems, so this should be really relevant to what's going on right now. So we are talking about the respiratory system, and the major function of the respiratory system is to supply the body with oxygen. That oxygen is used for cellular respiration, what we've gone through before in the mitochondria. Oxygen is the electron acceptor that allows us to make ATP efficiently. The respiratory system also gets rid of carbon dioxide, which is a waste product of cellular respiration. And the respiratory and circulatory system, therefore, are coupled very closely together. Can't survive without one, can't survive without the other. We need the circulatory system to deliver what the respiratory system is exchanging for us. But the respiratory system also has a role in olfaction and speech, taste and speech. Respiration involves four processes. Respiratory system is the pulmonary ventilation, which is breathing, the movement of air into and out of the lungs. External respiration is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and the blood. And the circulatory system was going to transport the oxygen and carbon dioxide and deliver them for internal respiration, which is the exchange of oxygen between carbon dioxide and the systemic blood vessels and tissues. So the respiratory system is where we get pulmonary ventilation and external respiration. The circulatory system takes care of transporting and delivery for internal respiration, which happens at individual cells. So the major organs, if we look at functional anatomy, we're going to look in the upper respiratory system. We'll look at the nose, the nasal cavity, the only part of the respiratory system that we can actually visualize without cutting into someone. The paranasal sinuses, the pharynx, and then in the lower respiratory, we'll look at the larynx, trachea, bronchi, and then in the third section, we're going to look at the lungs and alveoli on their own. So plan to cover up through bronchi and branches in this particular video. So here's our rotating head. You can see when it goes around that side, you get a little bit of view of the internal structures, but when you look at an individual, all you can see is the nose. It's part of the respiratory system. So here's a cross section showing the major organs. And the nose, the external nose, nasal cavity, produce mucus, filter, warm, moisten, receptor for our sense of smell. Paranasal sinuses lighten the skull. We've talked about those before. The pharynx is a passageway for both air and food. We're going to see the pharynx again next week when we talk about digestive system. Then we go larynx, trachea, bronchi, alveoli, which make up the lungs, and the coverings of the lungs, the pleura. So if we start with the upper respiratory system, beginning with what we can see, the external portion of the respiratory system. The nose provides an airway for respiration, helps to moisten and warm air that's coming in, filters and cleans the air that's coming in, and it also serves as a resonating chamber for speech, so it helps with speech, and it has our olfactory receptors, which are going to contribute to our sense of taste. It's divided into two regions, the external nose and the nasal cavity. The external nose includes the root, which is the area between your eyebrows, the bridge, the dorsum nasi, which is the anterior margin, the front margin, and the apex, which is the tip of your nose. The nostrils, more correctly referred to as nares, are bounded on each side by ala. And the external nose is formed from the nasal and frontal bones in the top, the bridge and the root, respectively, the maxillary bones laterally, and plates of hyaline cartilage inferiorly. So we have the root and bridge of the nose, the dorsum nasi. These make up our nares, our nostrils, and they are covered with ala, and the apex is the tip of your nose. Underneath those structures, we have the nasal bone, septal cartilage in blue, maxillary bone as part of the frontal process. There are other minor cartilages and dense fibrous connective tissues, along with the major alar cartilages. Nasal cavity is found within and posteriorly to the external nose. It's divided in the middle by the nasal septum, and that septum is formed in the front by septal cartilage and towards the back by the vomer bone and a perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, if you remember those from our discussions of the skeleton. Posterior nasal apertures, conae, are openings where the nasal cavity turns into the nasal pharynx, and the roof is formed by the ethmoid bone and sphenoid bone. And the floor is formed from the hard palate and the soft palate being muscle, the hard palate being bone. The nasal vestibule is the nasal cavity above the nostrils, superior to the nostrils. It's lined with vibrissae, which are hair that filter coarse particles from inspired air. The rest of the nasal cavity is lined with mucous membranes. There is olfactory mucosa, which lines the superior region of the nasal cavity and has our olfactory epithelium that we discussed when we talked about the special sense of smell. There's also respiratory mucosa, which is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium with goblet cells resting on the lamina propria, and that has seromucous nasal glands to give us a runny nose. Seromucus, they secrete mucus and the watery fluid that has enzymes in it. The mucus and serous secretions also contain lysozyme and defensins, which we've talked about before, protecting against bacterial infections. The ciliated cells are going to sweep mucus towards the throat, posteriorly towards the throat, and that mucus will be swallowed and go to the stomach, where anything in it should be destroyed in hydrochloric acid. Inspired air is going to be warmed. There are plexuses and capillaries here, veins of the nasal cavity, and they will transfer heat to the air. The mucosa contains sensory nerve endings that can cause sneezing, force particles out of the cavity. The conchae are small mucus-covered projections that protrude medially from each of the lateral walls of the nasal cavity, divided into three sections: the superior, the middle, and the inferior. There's a nasal meatus inferior to each one of those, and that shape helps to increase mucosal surface area. Another great example of folding or folding-like structures to increase surface area. And it also helps to enhance air turbulence, so things don't go directly through the nose. The turbulence occurs and it mixes as it goes down, and warming. So during inhalation, the conchae and the nasal mucosa help to filter, heat, and moisten the air, and they're going to do the same thing on the way out, except in reverse. So when we bring cool air in, we want to filter anything that's in it, we want to warm it up before it gets to our core, and we want to moisten it before it gets to our core. So in order to conserve heat and moisture, we want to reclaim that when we are exhaling. The paranasal sinuses are going to form a ring around the nasal cavity. They're located in the frontal, sphenoid, ethmoid, and maxillary bones. We've talked about them before, especially about lightening the skull when we talked about the skeleton. But they also secrete mucus, and that's going to help warm and moisten the air. So here are those conchae and the meatuses between them. Give you a fold-like structure. So air doesn't just go flying right through. It gets in here and gets caught in turbulence, which helps warm it, moisten it, and filter anything out of it. And here is a cross-section of a person's face, deceased person, cadaver. So rhinitis is an inflammation of the nasal mucosa. The nasal mucosa is continuous with the mucosa of the respiratory tract. So infections often spread from the nose to the throat to the chest. They can also spread to tear ducts, paranasal sinuses. That can cause blockage of sinus pathways, and that results in sinusitis or inflammation of the sinuses. That can lead to absorption of air, which might produce a vacuum and give a sinus headache. The pharynx is a funnel-shaped muscular tube that runs from the base of the skull to vertebrae C6, connecting the nasal cavity and mouth to the larynx in the esophagus. The esophagus would be part of the digestive system, the larynx where we want the air to go. It's composed of skeletal muscle, and it's divided into the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. The nasopharynx is a passageway posterior to the nasal cavity, contains pseudostratified columnar epithelium. It's the soft palate in the uvula will close the nasopharynx when we swallow. This is a location for pharyngeal tonsils, which are also called the adenoids, located on the posterior wall, and the pharyngotympanic tubes, formerly referred to as auditory tubes, because I guess auditory was too easy to say, drain and equalize pressure in the middle ear and open into the lateral walls. Actually, pharyngotympanic tubes is much more descriptive. The oropharynx is a passageway for food and air from the level of the soft palate to the epiglottis. Its lining consists of stratified squamous epithelium, and that's because there's going to be more wear and tear in the oropharynx than there was in the nasopharynx. This is a passageway for food as well, so we want stratified layers of cells to replace those that are lost at the top. There's also an isthmus of Fosses, which is an opening to the oral cavity. The palatine tonsils are located on the lateral wall of those fosses, and the lingual tonsils are located on the posterior surface of the tongue. The laryngopharynx is also a passageway for food and air. It's posterior to the upright epiglottis, extends into the larynx where it's continuous with the esophagus. It's lined again with stratified squamous epithelium, because there is more wear and tear here. So, nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. Infected and swollen adenoids can block air passage in the nasopharynx, making it necessary to breathe through the mouth. And as a result, the air is not properly moistened, warmed, or filtered before it gets to the lungs. And when the adenoids are chronically enlarged, both speech and sleep can be disturbed. We go to the lower respiratory system. We're going to be looking at the larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. It's going to be divided into two zones: the respiratory zone, where gas exchange actually occurs, and the conducting zones that are used to transport the gas from outside to in or inside to out, depending on whether you're inspiring or expiring. So the respiratory zone is going to be microscopic structures like the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, and the actual alveoli, while the conducting zones are going to be all the other respiratory structures, and they are going to continually help to clean, warm, and humidify the air. So the larynx, the voice box, extends from the third to the sixth vertebrae and attaches to the hyoid bone. Opens into the laryngopharynx, is continuous with the trachea. It provides a patent airway, an open airway, routes air and food into the proper channels, and it is also the location of our vocal cords. Its framework consists of 9 sets of hyaline cartilage. The epiglottis is not hyaline, connected by membranes and ligaments. The thyroid cartilage is the large shield-shaped cartilage that looks like an upright open book, the spine being the laryngeal prominence, which you may have referred to as the Adam's apple. There are cricoid cartilages that are ring-shaped. 2 and 4 are arytenoid cartilages. 5 and 6 are cuneiform cartilages. And 7 and 8 are corniculate cartilages, followed by the epiglottis. That epiglottis is elastic cartilage, as opposed to hyaline as the others are. Covers the laryngeal inlet during swallowing, and it's covered with taste buds that contain a mucosa. Shown here. The vocal folds consist of vocal ligaments that form the core of the vocal folds. Those are the true vocal cords. Those ligaments lie deep to the laryngeal mucosa and attach to the arytenoid cartilages, to the thyroid cartilage. They contain elastic fibers that appear white because they don't have blood vessels in them. The glottis would be the opening between the vocal folds, and those folds will vibrate to produce sound as air rushes up from the lungs. The vestibular folds are actually false vocal cords. They're superior to the above the vocal cords. They're not involved in sound production, but they do help close the glottis during the process of swallowing. The epithelium of the larynx in the upper part is stratified squamous epithelium, and below the vocal cords, where we should only have air moving through, is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Here's a cartilaginous framework of the larynx and from the back. Artist rendering from the side. And here are our vocal folds, this being the epiglottis up here, opened and closed. So voice is produced by the intermittent release of expired air during the opening and closing of the glottis. The pitch is going to be determined by the length and the tension in the vocal cords. Loudness will be determined by the force of air moving through the vocal cords. And there are chambers in the pharynx, the oral, nasal, and sinus cavities that help to amplify and enhance the sound quality. And finally, the sound is going to be shaped into language by muscles of the pharynx, tongue, soft palate, and the lips. There is a sphincter function of the larynx. Those vocal folds act as a sphincter to prevent air passage, and that is used, for example, when someone does the Valsalva maneuver, as it's called. The glottis would be closed. That prevents exhaling. Abdominal muscles would contract, which would increase the intra-abdominal pressure, and that is used to help empty the rectum. It's also used to stabilize the trunk if you are lifting something heavy. Laryngitis is an inflammation of the vocal folds that cause the vocal folds to swell, and that interferes with their ability to vibrate. That results in change to vocal tone, causing hoarseness, and it even in severe cases can lead to the fact that you can only whisper. You can't get much sound through it. Laryngitis is most often caused by a viral infection, but it can be due to the overuse of the voice. It can be due to very dry air. Bacterial infections can do it. Tumors are possible of the vocal cords, and irritating chemicals may lead to laryngitis. Below that is the trachea, or the windpipe, which extends from the larynx to the mediastinum, where it divides into two main bronchi. It's about 4 inches long and 3/4 of an inch in diameter. It is very flexible. Its wall is composed of mucosa, which are ciliated pseudostratified epithelium with intermittent goblet cells. The submucosa is connective tissue with seromucous glands that are supported by 16 to 20 C-shaped cartilage rings that prevent it from collapsing. And then there is an outermost layer of adventitia that is connective tissue. Trachealis is the smooth muscle fibers that connect the posterior parts of the cartilage rings. Those do contract when we cough or expel or trying to expel mucus. The carnea are the last tracheal cartilages. It expanded and found at the point where the trachea branches into the two main bronchi. The mucosa here is very sensitive, and if it is touched or a foreign object makes its way to it, it will lead to a violent coughing fit. And here's a microscopic view of it. And an electron microscope of the cilia on the ciliated pseudostratified epithelium. Smoking inhibits and ultimately destroys those cilia, and without the cilia, the only way to get mucus from accumulating in the lungs is to cough. However, when a person stops smoking, ciliary function usually recovers within a few weeks. Morning smoker's cough should subside once that ciliary function is restored. Tracheal obstruction is life-threatening. Many people have suffocated after choking on a piece of food that suddenly closed off their trachea. Everyone should know the Heimlich maneuver, which is a procedure to use the air in the lungs to push out, expel, pop out the obstructing piece of food. It is a relatively simple to learn, easy to do, but it should be learned by demonstration by an instructor who's qualified. If you do it wrong, it's possible to break ribs, but if you don't do it, your patient is going to choke. The bronchi, or air passages, I said already, they divide twice at the beginning. Then they continue to divide another 23 orders of branching. And that gives us a bronchial tree. And from the tips of the bronchial tree, we have the conducting zone structures that will lead to the respiratory zone structures. That conducting zone structures first forms the right and left primary bronchi. The right is wider, shorter, more vertical than the left. Each main bronchus enters the hilum of one of the two lungs, and each main bronchus then branches into lobular or secondary bronchi. There are 3 of those on the right, 2 on the left, and each lobular bronchus supplies 1 lobe of the lung. Each bronchus is divided into segmental or tertiary bronchi. Those segmental bronchi divide repeatedly out to a total of 23 times from the beginning, and those branches become smaller and smaller. A bronchiole would be less than 1 millimeter in diameter, and the terminal bronchioles, the smallest of all the branches, are less than 0.5 millimeter in diameter. In the conducting zone from the bronchi to the bronchioles, there are changes that will occur in the structures. The support structure, cartilage, will become regular plates. Bronchioles, elastic fibers, will replace the cartilage altogether. Epithelium type will change. Pseudostratified columnar is going to give way to cuboidal. Cilia and goblet cells are going to become more sparse. The amount of smooth muscle is going to increase. And that allows the bronchioles to provide for substantial resistance to air passage, which we'll use to regulate the lungs, as we'll see later on. The respiratory zones begin where the terminal bronchi feed into respiratory bronchioles. They lead into alveolar ducts and finally into alveolar sacs or sacules. Those sacs contain clusters of alveoli. There is about 300 million alveoli in making up the vast majority of the volume of our lungs. That is the actual site of gas exchange. The respiratory membrane is the blood-air barrier, consists of the alveoli and the capillary walls along their fused basement membranes. They are very thin. 0.5 micron, approximately 0.5 micron. That allows gas exchange across the membrane by simple diffusion down its concentration gradient and pressure gradients that we'll talk about later on. The alveolar wall consists of a single layer of squamous epithelium, which are type 1 alveolar cells. There are also type 2 alveolar cells in there that secrete surfactant as well as antimicrobial proteins. There are other significant features. They are surrounded by fine elastic fibers and pulmonary capillaries. There are alveolar pores that connect adjacent alveoli. That helps to equalize air pressure throughout the lungs, and it also provides alternate routes in case there are blockages elsewhere. The alveolar macrophages are another set of cells that keep the surfaces sterile. There are 200 million dead macrophages per hour are lifted by the cilia to the throat and then swallowed. And I'm going to stop there. The next video will pick up here at lungs and pleurae.